the Pew Research does a lot of research on religious data in the United States, and they do some large surveys periodically. And a couple of the data points that they were tracking go back to 2007 and 2014, and changes in percentages of adherence to various denominations and religious bodies. And when they asked, this is massive phone surveys, I believe tens of thousands of people that they contact to ask these questions. And so they asked people what denomination they were affiliated with in 2007 and 2014. And I'm just going to share some data here on Churches of Christ and then some other groups, because one of the things that comes up in talking about these sorts of things is, well, how do we compare to other groups? How do we compare to the Baptists? How do we compare to the Methodists? How do we compare to Presbyterians? Are we in an especially vicious decline? Or are we about on par with everybody else? Or other people growing while we're in decline? Kind of like, how do we stack up? And that's a natural human question to ask. Are we doing far, far worse than everybody else? Are we doing somewhat better? Or kind of like, well, everyone else, if they're dropping off at 10% a year and we're only tracking in, I'm dropping 3% a year, then not that we feel good about that, but at least it puts it in a little bit of a relative context in relation to other people around us and how other groups are doing. Not that that's any rationale for making decisions or making changes or anything else. It just kind of helps put things in a larger religious landscape within the United States culture of exactly what's going on out there. And when you look at Pew's data from 2007 and 2014, I'm going to put a link to that in the description of the video so you can go look at it for yourself. Percentages of people in 2007 who affiliated themselves with Churches of Christ was 1.5%. Now, when they re-asked that question again in 2014, the number of people who said that they were affiliated with Churches of Christ were 1.5%. Okay, now this is a really interesting thing on several levels. And of course, 2014, was 6 years ago, almost 7 years ago. So there have been some things that have happened in the meantime. But, when we look at the growth or decline charts of Churches of Christ, we see this big drop, like 100,000 members between 2007, 80 to 100,000 members between 2007 and 2014. But when asked of the population, tens of thousands of respondents, they get 1.5% of the population identifying with Churches of Christ in the United States. And I find that very, very interesting because, if you look at the population numbers of the United States in 2007, it's like 301,200,000 people or so, give or take, a couple people. If you look at the population in 2014 in the United States, it's 318,400,000. So there was like a 17,200,000 person gain in the United States between 2007 and 2014. So what that means is if 1.5% of people are Church of Christ in 2007 and 1.5% of people are Church of Christ in 2014, you actually have a net 258,000 member gain because the U.S. population grows, and now you're taking 1.5% of a larger number. You're taking 1.5% of 318,400,000, and so you get 4,776,000 adherents, which is crazy because when we collect the data, and this is something that's very important for us to consider and discuss, when in-house we collect our own data, we get far, far less than that. When 21st Century Christian collects this data, and they did this in 2020, they found that there are 1.1 million baptized members in Churches of Christ and 1.4 million adherents, people who recognize themselves as Churches of Christ. They may have never been baptized, but they're affiliated with that. It's where they consider to be their church home. And as far as attendance goes, it's like right at 1.1 million people in 2020, according to 21st Century Christian. Now, 1.4 million adherents to Churches of Christ. Well, it really makes you wonder about how we're counting, because and it also gets into question of when people say they're Church of Christ from a Pew Research phone call survey, what exactly does that mean that they're saying? I would put that in the adherent category. These are people who affiliate themselves with that, but are not necessarily dyed-in-the-wool Church of Christ people. So it's important for us to understand what these numbers are really saying, and for us to also just consider the fact that When we do our own self-count, we always come out a lot less than when other people count. And part of that is because the people who are doing the counting, like in 21st century Christian, are looking for a cappella only churches of Christ, as far as I understand from their last count. Now, like 10 years ago or so, they kind of made that change to a cappella, and they put instrumental churches in kind of their own little group there in the book, if my memory is correct, and then kind of went back on that a bit. Maybe the adding in of those congregations was kind of the going backness of it. But now they're looking at a cappella only, and when you do that, you're going to get far less adherents. Okay, and so if there are 4.7 million adherents in Churches of Christ in the United States, people who affiliate or associate themselves with Churches of Christ in the United States, according to the data that IMP and others have come out with, in 2007 we're looking at like 1.25 million, and in 2014 we're looking at like 1.18 million. So where are the 3 million people? Where are the 3 million people? And this is something that's very important for us to ask ourselves. We kind of get in this mentality of, well, when people leave, that, they just go ahead and affiliate with some other group. They attend a non-denominational church or whatever. But as it turns out, there are a lot of people out there. It looks to me like about 3 million people sitting out in the United States who still consider themselves to be Churches of Christ, who are not being counted as adherents or still in the membership rolls of our churches for 21st century Christian to come along and do surveys and find out those kind of numbers. Okay, so that's the first thing that we need to consider, is when you just ask, generally speaking, with a very small margin of error, because there's tens of thousands of people in these surveys, what is your religious affiliation? 1.5% of people in 2007 said they're Church of Christ, which translates to about 4.5 million people. And in 2014, they said the same, 1.5%, which is almost 4.8 million people. While we're tracking 1.2 million people as adherents, people out there, when you ask, actually tracks 4.8, 4.7, 4.8 million people. So there's a lot of people out there. There's like a 3 million person discrepancy between the people who we identify as our own and the people who identify as part of us. As far as in terms of asking people how they self-identify, people hold on more strongly to Church of Christ than they do to Baptist, than they do to Methodist, than they do to Presbyterian. And I think that's a really interesting thing, and it makes sense, within our own cultural heritage, within our own DNA in Churches of Christ. We have a very strong DNA. We have a very strong identifying marker system within our own fellowship of what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be Church of Christ. Like, is a pretty locked down thing for the most part, although it's gotten fuzzier over the years on some level. So I found that very interesting in some senses. Is that hopeful or not? That's up for debate. I think it's somewhat hopeful that there are still people who say, yeah, I've left, but I still identify with that. That maybe those are some people that we can reach, those 3 million people out there. So how do we compare to other groups, okay? How do we in the Churches of Christ compare to the Baptists or the Methodists or the Presbyterians in terms of decline? Are they going through the same kind of decline we are? And again, this is 6-year-old data. I'll get some updated data. I've been kind of crunching those numbers and working through it, and I'll get that to you here shortly. In 2007, 10.8% of the population were Baptists. That's about 32 million and a half people. In 2014, that number dropped from 10.8 to 9.2%. Okay, not like a 1.5 to 1.5. There was a 1.6 percentage point drop in 7 years, which is about 3.2 million person drop over 7 years, which is about 500,000 people a year being kind of knocked out of the Baptist church, walking away from the Baptist church, dying in the Baptist church, not being replaced, however that may work out. In the Methodist church in 2007, they were 5.4% of the population. That's 16.2 million people. In 2014, they were 3.9% of the U.S. population. That's about 12.4 million people. So they had a drop of 1.5% over those 7 years. Okay. Now, both the Baptists and the Methodists have more adherents than Churches of Christ from the beginning, but we see that they're not holding steady. And I think that we would say, realistically, we're also not holding steady. Even though 1.5% and 1.5% on a growing number as the U.S. population increases are still identifying as Churches of Christ, we're watching our actual attendance numbers still realistically go down. And that's like what IMP and Tim Woodruff and Stan Gramberg and those guys are assessing, more like boots on the ground numbers. Pew Research, when they ask these questions, are talking more big picture, like phone surveys, just asking like, who do you affiliate or associate yourself with? So the Methodists actually did have a 1.5% drop, Baptist 1.6% drop over 7 years. Presbyterians went from 1.9% of the population in 2007 to 1.4%. So they had a 0.5% drop as well, from about 5.7 million down to 4.4 million people within the Presbyterian Church. So, everybody's pretty much in decline, and we can't really measure the actual decline of churches based on a phone survey, based on what people, how they affiliate themselves or who they recognize themselves as being a part of. We understand that that's limited in its effectiveness in terms of actual church growth. There may be people attending. I know people who attend Churches of Christ who do not affiliate themselves with Churches of Christ. And so you get into a whole nother dynamic with that. But I do think it's hopeful in the sense of there are a lot of people out there who still recognize themselves as part of the Church of Christ, who are not attending the Churches of Christ, and that gives me some hope that maybe some of those people could be won back. I don't think that's necessarily a great strategy for the future of church growth or where those numbers are going to come from. In one sense, we could say maybe those are some low-hanging fruit, that there's like 3 million people out there who still identify with us who are not a part of us. And maybe because our differences are probably fairly small in the whole scheme of things, maybe we could reclaim them fairly easily or quickly. But I do think that the future of the church is reaching out to the nones, the non-religiously affiliated people, which is the fastest growing religious group in the United States. The people who are agnostic, people who are atheists, people who just say nothing. I'm just not anything at all. That's the fastest growing group in the United States. Hopefully this puts this into some context, and I will put some links into the description for you to check some of this out for yourself, so that you can make some of your own decisions and conclusions about what the numbers are and what you think about what does that mean for our future and where we're headed. And we have certainly lost some people. But there's still hope. And I think that we need to be focused on the hope. We need to be focused on the message. We need to be focused on the good news. We need to be focused on changing lives. We need to be focused on loving people. We need to be focused on the core message of the gospel. We need to be focused on keeping peripheral things peripheral and just keep moving ahead in our convictions, because the Church of Christ truly does have some wonderful things to offer to the world. I think our baptismal theology, when done well, is phenomenal. I think our Lord's Supper theology is exceptional, and I don't want to see those things go away. I want to see those things strengthened. I want to see those things perpetuated. So thank you so much for checking this out. And you may not be a numbers person, but maybe there's something still in here for you. And it's rare that we talk about that sort of thing here, but I thought this was interesting enough to bring up, and hopefully it blesses you. Hopefully it just shines some light on some things that you may have had questions about, and informs our path forward. So God bless you. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe, tell a friend. Just, I'm telling you too many things to do. But the main thing is just hang in there, keep watching, and share what it is that you're thinking as you hear all of this and what your experience is. Maybe you're someone who's ex-Church of Christ, that you've walked away, but you still affiliate with this body because they're the people you love. They're the people that you know, and you haven't really quite walked away from it, although you're not necessarily really attending that. So thank you so much for all you do. Love you. God bless you, and see you next time.